Mr. President, I want to talk today about the Obama administration's nuclear agreement with Iran and the many ways that that agreement has failed to rein in Iranian hostile behavior over the course of the last year. I thought it was interesting over the last week, the great reluctance on the part of people who voted for in an enabling way to allow the Iranian agreement to occur, to take a stand on the position that Mr. Cotton brought to the Senate floor, where we wouldn't now give Iran millions of dollars to purchase heavy water that they would use to in their nuclear activities, and obviously continue, Mr. President, to produce. In addition to that, I saw on Monday of this week Iran tested a variant missile with a range of over 2,000 kilometers capable of striking Israel. Just over and over and over again, we see Iran participating in hostile behavior, and somehow none of that behavior violates either the spirit or the letter of the agreement that was discussed as such an important breakthrough with what was going to happen in Iran. For those of us who predicted that Iran's behavior would not change and behavior in the neighborhood would change in fear of what would happen because of Iran, I think those predictions are becoming more and more obviously true. April the 2nd, 2015, a framework agreement was reached on that program. Here we are a year later. This agreement seems to have not accomplished any of the things that you would want to accomplish with the country of Iran. According to President Obama, Iran so far has followed the letter of the agreement, but the spirit of the agreement involves Iran also sending signals to the world community and business that it's not going to be engaging in a range of provocative actions that might scare business off. That's an absolute quote from the president. Now, why we're concerned about scaring business off from Iran, I don't know, because another quote from the administration over and over again is that Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. I think if we were talking more about that activity of Iran and less about what they need to do to encourage business activity, we'd be doing what we should be doing. Jennifer Rubin wrote in the Washington Post that, quote, his comments are curious both because of the letter of the agreement reference. His comments are curious both because of the letter of the agreement seems to be forever changing to incorporate Iran's demands, and because despite Iran's actions, the president continues to make more and more concessions. The administration sold this deal on the promise that we'd see a great change in behavior. Take, for example, the behavior that has occurred. Iran's continued disregard for the United Nations Security Council resolution dealing with ballistic missiles. Iran's conclusion after the nuclear deal last summer that it could test fire new classes of missiles whenever it wanted to, as I just mentioned, as late as last Monday. In October, they tested new missiles that were precision-guided and more sophisticated than the current missiles they have. They then have now tested missiles that could reach Israel. Despite the UN Security Council explicitly calling for Iran to halt its ballistic missile activity, Iran's leaders have consistently rebuffed anything that's coming from the international community that it says is out of bounds of the resolution, and apparently everything is out of bounds of the resolution. In August of 2014, the deputy foreign minister of Iran and chief nuclear negotiator told the Tehran Times, quote, the restrictions on weapons posed through Resolution 2231 are not mandatory and we can disregard them. That statement directly contradicts Secretary of State Kerry's statement when he talked about the resolution, when he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last July, on July the 23rd, Secretary Kerry said they are restrained from any sharing of missile technology, purchase of missile technology, exchange of missile technology work on missiles. They cannot do that under Article 41, which is Chapter 7 and mandatory, end quotes from our Secretary of State. Obviously, the administration has a much different interpretation of the current UN resolutions than Iran, but they also appear to have a completely flexible interpretation of what the agreement actually says. March of this year, just a few weeks ago, the Department of Justice unsealed an indictment of Iranians who carried on cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in the financial sector of the United States with the knowledge of the Iranian government. Now, what does critical infrastructure mean? Critical infrastructure means the utilities, it means the transportation network, it means the things that we have to rely on every day to provide the infrastructure the country needs to function. Also, financial sector, pretty obvious, but the Iranians, with the knowledge of the Iranian government, continue to attack that as well. The indictment notes that one of the hackers, quote, received credit for his computer intrusion work from the Iranian government toward completion of his mandatory military service in Iran. Now, I don't know any way to interpret that, but say not only you're in the Iranian military, and if you want to cyber attack the United States, we'll give you military service time to do that. I'd think that the administration would consider applying sanctions to put more pressure on Iran, not worry quite so much about Iran's future business opportunities. Curiously, yet predictably, the administration has taken the opposite approach and continues to reward bad behavior. That reward can come and has come in the administration basically easing financial restrictions that prohibit U.S. dollars from being used in transactions with Iran. The dollar continues to be the principal economic currency of the world. Why we would want Iran to have more access to that currency, I don't know, yet Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew said that giving Iran access to U.S. currency would ease the blockade, and said, quote, since Iran's kept up its end of the deal, it's our responsibility to uphold ours in both letter and spirit, end quote. Now, there may only be 5 people in the world, and they're all in the Obama administration, who believe that Iran has kept up its end of the deal. April of the 2nd of this year, Eli Lake wrote about how the president has to keep on giving to save his Iran deal. In other words, Mr. Lake wrote, quote, that he, beginning quote, was under the impression the nuclear negotiations with Iran ended in July. There was no press conference in Vienna. The UN resolution that lifted the sanctions on Iran and the fight in Congress that follows, that turns out has been to have been wrong. He goes on further to say it wasn't part of the deal in July, which only lifted nuclear-related sanctions on Iran, but kept other sanctions to punish the country's support for terrorism, human rights, and ballistic missile programs. We don't seem nearly as committed to those sanctions. On April the 3rd, 2016, the ambassador of the UAE to the United States wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal highlighting concerns about Iranian actions in the year since the nuclear deal. The ambassador pointed out that behind the talk of change, the Iran we have long known is still around. He then goes on to list the concerning actions Iran has taken in the last year. Again, according to the ambassador from the neighborhood, the ambassador from the UAE, one action, according to him, actions such as firing rockets near the USS Truman aircraft carrier in December of 2015 while the Truman was peacefully transitioning the Strait of Hormuz. Number two, actions such as detaining 10 American Navy sailors in January of 2016. Number three, actions such as Iranian visits to Russia to purchase military fighter jets and equipment, presumably with the billions they received as part of the nuclear deal. And according to the ambassador, the list could go on, with Iranian influence continuing to cause instability in Yemen, in Syria, and Iran's support for Hezbollah. Now, there can be no doubt that the Obama administration's nuclear agreement with Iran has left regional allies nervous. The ambassador from the UAE, in the editorial I referenced, has made that point very clearly, and I'd like to submit that editorial as part of the record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the administration's nuclear agreement has left the region nervous, has left the world less stable, has left our colleagues here in the Senate who voted for it unwilling to vote on anything else about Iran. I think they're finding that the people that you and I work for and that they work for don't believe this was a good agreement, and we will be talking about this agreement and the aftermath that the agreement has created for a long time. I would say we need to restore a world where America's friends trust us and our enemies are afraid of us. It's a dangerous world if you have exactly the opposite of that happening, when our friends don't trust us and our enemies aren't afraid of us. And this Iranian agreement is one of the reasons that that's the case, Mr. President, and I would yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.